Hi everyone. So thanks very much for the intro, Dan, and it's a great opportunity to kind of come back to an event that I probably went to the first time about 6 years ago to give something back to the community, kind of setting me off on this route. So you kind of escaped your notice in the UK that some things have changed in the last probably 3 months. So we went from kind of not really having biometrics at all in our financial services organisations to some pretty kind of hefty set of announcements just before Christmas, after Christmas. So we're imminently faced with a situation whereby by the end of the year we could be looking at something like half the population of the UK being in scope for voice biometric solutions at least one of the big four banks. So what I want to do today is give a bit of an inside story as to how some of that has evolved over the last few years, and also a bit of apologies first off. So we had hoped that we'd be able to do a panel discussion with some of those banks, but for one reason or another they've been unable to join us today. So you get to hear me paraphrase bits of my story from parts of those implementations and a bit of an emerging hypothesis about what's been really going on. So first, a bit about me. So I've spoken at a couple of these events in the past. So I pretty much spent most of my career trying to put people, process and technology together to solve problems that people said at the outset couldn't be solved. And it was great to hear the discussion about cyber criminals earlier, because the first half of that was spent in the military and in counter-terrorism, where I basically spent most of my time teaching people how to be terrorists so that they could defeat terrorists, which kind of is very similar to the kind of model we find ourselves in now with cyber fraud and similar. The second half has been spent in customer services, in contact centres, customer experience, change delivery and business design in some of the largest financial services organisations in the UK. Most recently as the interim contact centre transformation director at Barclays, and prior to that leading business architecture teams at Lloyds banking group. I'm now working with some other banks who I can't mention to help them accelerate the delivery of voice biometric solutions and to maximise the impact of those. So this is a bit of the inside story of that. Quick look at the agenda. So I want to go through a bit of context first off for those visiting from outside the UK who may not have seen it, and a bit of hypothesis as to what's really happened in the intervening years. Then we'll go on to look at some of the challenges, and this is meant as more of a reality check to some of the more hypothetical discussions we've had at the beginning, and to help both vendors and end users understand kind of how they can work together a bit more effectively. And then we'll finish with just some kind of key takeaways that, again, both from the user and vendor side, I hope you find helpful as you shape your offerings and programs. So let's look at the UK context first off then. So this is the news that kind of escaped your notice, particularly if you're interested in this field. And so we're now faced with a situation where Barclays, having announced in kind of mid-2014 that they would deploy for all their retail banking clients, but not yet seen. And HSBC, who announced just after Christmas that they'd be deploying voice biometrics for all of their retail banking clients in the UK. And clearly we have two other large banks in the UK who are surely now thinking, I wonder what we should be doing. And they together represent 75% of the UK current account market. Those first two banks have something like 30 million customers in the UK, so that's half the population. Something like 10 to 20,000 frontline colleagues in just those two banks alone will need to understand voice biometrics and how it's being implemented and how it's being implemented in those businesses. So some things are really changing in the UK. It's really interesting to note when I show this timeline, checking kind of Dan's notes, the first UK voice biometrics conference was in 2007, when I think Dan, no disrespect, probably stood up here discussing the imminent deployment of voice biometrics by large financial services organisations that then didn't necessarily materialise. So just so we're all talking from the same frame of reference, we've got a couple of announcements implementation here. So a long dead period, and we'll talk about a bit of why that might have been in the kind of 2007 when the technology largely is the same, through to 2012 when Barclays Wealth and a program I led first went live, and then spent kind of 9 months before we told anyone about it. Probably shows you the kind of the confidence in the market at the time. Through to mid-2014 when the chief executive via our Sunday Telegraph announcement, somewhat to the surprise of his teams, announced that Barclays would be implementing voice biometrics for all retail banking customers. And then again, a period of silence until the back end of last year, where Atom, who are a challenger bank in the UK, so it's a new bank being built for the internet and mobile age from the ground up, announced that it would be using facial and voice biometrics in both their app and in their contact centres. They are imminently live. They're inviting their first customers on board at the moment. I clearly haven't made it at the top of their list yet, although I did get a postcard from them with a giraffe coloured by a employee's child the other day, so I think I'm getting close to the top of the list. Early in 2016 then, HSBC announced that both for their First Direct brand, which is a kind of no IVR business in the UK, will be using a passive non-text dependent solution, and their larger retail bank will be using a text dependent solution in the IVR, both for release imminently, with the IVR solution following later in the year. And then finally, just in kind of late February, early March, TalkTalk, who are a large UK telco, who suffered quite a crippling data privacy breach at the back end of 2015, announced that they're went live with a text-dependent IVR solution. So a lot of activity. Got a few hypotheses about what happened in the intervening years. Might be just interesting to share a little bit. So it's not that no one's been looking at this issue. In 2007, 2008, some of the vendors, some of the participants in this room who've been in this industry for a long time will have spent an awful lot of time locked in technology centres, data centres with and security offices with people from these large banks, looking and evaluating these solutions and coming to some reasonable conclusions about how effective they may or may not be. So what happened? Well, first off, there are a few less banks now than there were then, and most of those organisations had a lot more things to focus on in the 2008-2009 period than this, and that the business cases were not necessarily ever balanced in the right direction. The solutions were definitely viable, but the business cases weren't balanced. So that kind of distracted people through 2008, 2009 and took up a lot of investment capacity and change capacity. And then we get into the early 2010s, not sure what you call that kind of decade, and we are headlong into the mobile rush, the mobile gold rush, and you might have liked to believe that you wouldn't need a contact centre and you might never need to talk to a customer again through this period. And we're also deploying pretty rapidly new technology solutions. Inevitably in their first instances, those were reasonably vulnerable, and therefore a lot of attention and focus on securing at the same time as trying to deploy new functionality, which kind of takes us through to the start of 2014, 2015, when things start to change. So a bit about why things started to change then, and this is a kind of an insider's view of what has been happening there. Well, first of all, we've got our wonderful security versus convenience theory that I'm sure some of you are familiar with, and we've got this great curve that exists, and I can just choose where I want to operate on the curve and get the right balance of security and convenience for every situation. But in practice, it doesn't quite work that way, and I get one method, and it kind of might have some convenience and some security, but I'm not quite sure where it is. I don't actually consciously choose to position it anywhere. It's not quite working for me in any situation, so I get another one because I need to do something slightly more risky, or I get a new type of attack, and then I need to add another one because that was just a bit too hard and people can't really do what they were supposed to be doing, and all of a sudden people have stopped signing up for new accounts. And then I kind of need to add another because even that was too hard. And then you know this kind of story. It just gets a bit kind of proliferating. And this kind of happened for all the right reasons. And at the time, it's kind of a function of the way organisations were reacting to the situation. But it doesn't really make the situation any more easier for people to deal with. Oh, even another one, yeah. actually go to a branch where we'd rather not have them in necessarily every case. So what's changed then? So I love this photo. Bearing in mind at the start of that photo, there was no iPhone in 2007, until later 2007. So this is the history of the iPhone through that time. So we didn't have any of the kind of technologies that we have available, the kind of issues of usability, speed, access, and mobile were just not there as an issue. So we've been through quite an evolution from the iPhone 3, or the iPhone through the 3G, 3GS down to what we have today, and the kind of enormous amount of computing power in our pockets. But significantly at the same time, consumers' expectation of convenience has changed, and their demands that they're going to get the right balance of effort for security have changed quite significantly. And it's much, in this kind of field, we've much maligned, but it did strike me at the weekend as I had to fix something on my 6-year-old son iPad that is inevitably a kind of tech hand-me-down, that I had to enter a passcode into the thing, which is like it's just not something I've become used to, and is a really kind of cognitively disruptive experience, whereas in the past that just would not have been something that I would have considered. What's also happening is channel usage changing. So people are spending more and more time on these sort of devices and less time in direct interaction with their banks. So they get used to the patterns here, but they've become less and less well trained to interact with our other channels. And each of those kind of interactions becomes a bit more challenging as they kind of have to move from what they've been used to the kind of the dance that we sometimes make them go through. Finally then, kind of as we talked about before, some expectation changes in terms of privacy, and people are a lot more conscious now about, they don't necessarily, they expect themselves to be secured by their financial services provider, but they don't necessarily want to spend the effort doing it. But then finally, on the kind of the flip side of this, and I'm never going to do justice to the first presentation, so thanks for lining this up, it's been great. Just the sheer increase in sophistication of attacks we've seen against financial services organizations. I think that the industry has done a phenomenal job in maintaining fraud levels in some cases at reasonably similar levels year on year. I think 2014, which is the last year kind of publicly available data is available. However, we saw 20% year on year increases in fraud losses in nearly every channel. So that kind of reasonably after 2009 we saw some quite significant reductions in fraud, but clearly since 2014 and since then levels of fraud have increased significantly, as has the sophistication of those attacks. So it's not like people haven't been sitting in organizations trying to counter this stuff. There has been a huge array of investment and effort to counter a lot of these threats. Unfortunately, however, customers, in many cases, customers have started being the collateral damage in this kind of war of attrition. And the experience has suffered, and the costs associated with both maintaining the security environment, but also kind of smoothing off the rougher edges of it, have ballooned for many organizations. There isn't a lot of place to go when you suddenly understand a new attack vector other than stopping transactions or slowing down transactions. And when you do that, not every, but a significant proportion of your customers suddenly start reaching out and complaining and wanting to speak to somebody about getting that through. So there's not a lot of place to go when you have to react at the kind of the speed that we're seeing the need to do. I managed to get a UK identity for $25 US, so I thought I was doing quite well there. The stats are staggering. 500 million personal details lost in the last year alone. 500 million in losses to UK companies, to UK payment providers in 2014, which was the last time it's available. So what we're really seeing then is, in practice, kind of security and convenience trending to zero. And I know that's a bit of these existing methods, I know that's a bit of a stretch of imagination, but at some rate that is happening, and that's what's led people, I think now more than in the previous period, to look at kind of what are the ways of balancing out this case. So that's led a number of UK financial services organisations to look at voice biometrics for securing their contact centre channels, and also because those are often some of the weaker links in some of the online and mobile channels, because there are humans involved, they are more easily able to influence. The kind of the detection capabilities aren't necessarily there. There are lots of people making decisions. In some banks in the UK, there are still people sitting at the end of a telephone with a tick sheet of the questions they're supposed to ask customers, and they tick those questions as they ask them. And in some other UK banks, they change the questions that are getting asked on a weekly basis based on an intranet page. So the kind of the sophistication of approaches being used is fallen quite significantly behind mobile and online. So what I want to talk about, and kind of the meat of my presentation then, is really talking about the challenges that we've seen in those organisations as they get through maybe some past the kind of the initial highlights and into the realities of delivering these solutions into their organisations. So probably worth at this point just kind of taking a test of the room to see how many users, end users we've got versus vendors. It's always a dangerous question to ask. Anyone thinking of implementing voice security or otherwise here? Okay, got one. Okay, okay. So we'll play a bit to that, but we'll also kind of try and use this as a bit of a kind of how can you as vendors help organisations through some of these challenges. So this is my personal experiences of now 2.5 or so implementations in large different financial services organisations. What I don't want to do is detract from the kind of the real impact that these solutions can have, and many organisations see these solutions as magical in some respects. When you get the customer and the colleague and you see this thing work, you see this sort of stuff work for the first time, it has a transformational effect on both the role of the colleague and the way in which those interactions take place between customers and colleagues. And the long-term opportunities of getting this right are really significant. So what I don't want to do is detract from that, but what I do want to do is kind of bring home some of the truths about trying to deliver this. So I have this model, and it's called my program enthusiasm cycle, and it really applies to every change delivery program I've ever been involved in. So enthusiasm, because I can't think of a more quantitative metric, and time going along the bottom. Now, every change delivery program, and I've done kind of integrations, migrations, all the kind of the really horrible stuff that you don't want to do at banks, goes through this kind of cycle. But there's something particular about voice biometrics and security solutions, and particularly how we're moving from kind of a legacy authentication environment to the future that somehow extenuates the peaks and troughs of this model. So here's my, that's a laser, not that. So here's my wiggly line curve. And I'll just kind of try and highlight where I believe some of the peaks and troughs of this belong. So we start off really enthusiastic. So head of security, head of customer experience gets demoed something by somebody somewhere and is like, wow, this is the answer to all my prayers. And off we go, and we're talking to lots of people, and then somebody internally goes, do you know what, we tried that in 2007, it didn't really work. And then they go, have you got a business case for that? And you get lots of internal challenge. And yes, but then you need to go through the kind of the formal rigmarole of trying to create a business case, getting project approvals. And this kind of, on to project approval. And this is the kind of cycle that organisations have got stuck in for the last 7 or 8 years, yeah. So I've presented business cases for biometric solutions kind of in every annual investment round at most organisations I've worked in, and only 2 of them got approved. So a lot of organisations get stuck in this cycle. But then you're through project approval, and that really is changing, because the balance between kind of the sheer cost to maintain the security environment we have and its impact on customers, plus the really quite clear customer experience and cost benefits, really it's all started to come together in people's minds, plus all our competitors doing it. So if we don't do it, we're going to get stuck, and the kind of fear of what happens next. So we get through project approval, and then the vendors really descend on the organisation. Then you get lots of great demos, and you get shown some really great stuff, and you go really deep on the solutions that you're buying, and you start to make decisions about which vendors to work with. You start to mobilise and engage your project teams, and you start to draw out what the future world could look like. And it's a pretty magical world in some respects, of kind of every time a customer calls, they just use their voice and off they go, and they're authenticated. And yeah, that is what we're aiming for. But at some point, we realise that we actually have to implement that in the organisation in which we really live in, and we need to migrate customers from where they are today to our future world. So it's when that detailed design process starts, and then through into almost time for first user live. We're not finding kind of new hope and new promise. We're finding new challenges and new complexities about how we deliver this in our organization. But then we get a user live eventually, probably later than we expected to. But we get a user live, and the stories start coming back in from our front lines and from our customers, and they're great stories. And then one of two things happen. Either we have an incident, that first false accept that we prepared everyone for, but nonetheless, when it happens, that's that kind of testing point for an organization when people suddenly realize that they were signing up to a certain level of false accept, or when perhaps one of the metrics that somebody's established don't quite hit the expectations established back right down here at the kind of approval stage, and the first kind of executive kind of query about how well we're doing on that thing that I spent X million pounds on and 3 years work on gets questioned. So that's kind of, I'm glad we got some laughs from people in the audience. There's definitely some recognition going on there. We break that down into kind of a couple of parts of our delivery cycle. What I really want to talk about is, I think, just this discover and define stage where we're really talking about kind of how people get started on this journey. I think we've done to death, and I'm not going to cover much more on. What I want to talk about really is what we'd hope to have a panel here today to talk about is this kind of design, deliver, and deploy phase. So, going to start off then with design. So design is this kind of magical phase where you've got a project mobilized, you've got investment spending, you're starting to get everyone around the table, and then, can you guess this game? So the elephant in the room appears. Well, it's the elephant in my savannah. I love this photo. And it's probably not just one elephant, it's probably one big elephant and a couple of little elephants. And it's been kind of inferred to by people as well. So really, you start off this kind of discovery session of how voice biometrics, voice security might work in your organization with real optimism that this is the one golden bullet solution that's going to make the future so much better than it is today. And then you kind of realize that not only does it not just have to work in parallel, but it actually has to interoperate with all of those things that you had in the past. And then on top of that, it's actually not quite like the things you had in the past. So it's not that it's true or false. So with all those previous security methods, what I really had, particularly if I'm a front door kind of IVR solution or a contact center, I have a true or false. So they pass the test or they don't pass the test. If they pass the test, they do something, and then maybe some magic analytical black box in the background in transaction screening kind of stops some transactions and does something to them. But I've never really had to deal at the front door with this concept that we're only a certain percentage sure that they are who they claim to be. And that really, really hurts people's heads, particularly in an operational business. I think kind of fraud and analytics teams have been used to having those debates for a long time, and have kind of, in most organizations, have evolved models and ways of thinking to deal with it. But now we're talking about kind of, in some organizations, 10,000 contact center people may need to understand this principle that it's not just black and white, which is quite an education barrier to get over. I think then the kind of the minor elephants in the room I just want to kind of cover very briefly are the kind of the unhappy paths. We start realizing all sorts of things about the way in which our customers use our contact centers that we didn't necessarily, we always kind of knew were happening, but we'd never really had to cope with. One of those is I'm still trying to think of the best name for these. I'm sure some of our vendors have got a name for these, but the kind of legitimate, illegitimate customer. So my secretary always makes the transfers, and she always uses the customer's credentials, and she's not committing a fraud of any degree. We're providing a valuable service to that customer. No one's really complaining. There is risks in that. Yes, sure, it's a breach of our T's and C's, but it's something that's been happening for years, and now we have an issue where we're going to be able to detect that, and now we have to decide what to do with it. So in addition to that, our data model probably doesn't support any sort of concept other than you're an account holder and your name on the account. So we have a number of those kind of illegitimate customers, and then we have all sorts of kind of corner cases and unhappy paths to plot through the journey that in those kind of early days of kind of getting to know vendors and getting to know solutions, we don't really have to consider. So that's design. It's not to say there aren't ways through that, and we'll talk about those in a minute. Moving then to look at delivery in a little bit more detail, just conscious of time. I'm standing between us and a bar, so It's not a very British thing to do, stand in the way of a bar. I think just in the delivery space, there's kind of two major challenges to see with organizations. One is maintaining a consistency and balance of vision throughout an implementation. Very easy when you've got you've got your executive board sitting together agreeing whether to do something, and you've got kind of a reasonably finely tuned understanding of kind of the balance of security we want to take, what this solution is delivering for security, what it's supposed to deliver for cost, what it's supposed to deliver for customer experience. Then when you get into actual project delivery, all of those senior executives disappear, and actually it's not about kind of what the vision was, it's about who's got the most time to spend doing this stuff. So invariably, and no disrespect to security professionals love this stuff, whereas customer experience and operational managers, they've got like 5,000 people in a contact center that's just blowing up to worry about. So they have other issues than to get involved in the detail of delivery and sequencing of which customers go first. So there are real risks as you start to select customers for implementation that you skew the balance and you miss out on opportunities. So if you optimize for security, that might lead you to some decisions in both the design and the sequencing of implementation. If you're optimizing for cost, to others. So there's real risk that you kind of get that wrong, not deliberately. And I think a lot of these issues that I'm kind of bringing out are more, they're not about the hard science, they're not about your kind of quality of solutions, the quality of technology, they're cultural and decision-making issues within organizations. Final delivery issue then is back to the kind of, I can't believe I'm the first one to show this kind of curve in this session today, and I'm supposed to be the business person. So
you need more, like...
We need some choices on here, yeah? Oh, yeah, so, like, do you not ask a head of contact centers, like, where does he want to be on this curve to go live? Like, we're going to go live tomorrow with 1,000 customers. Which exactly position am I supposed to choose? No one trained an operations leader to do that. He sits with all the risk and liability. No one trained him to do that. He doesn't know, and he also doesn't know whether this is actually a real curve or just something we dreamt up in a computer and just drew on a piece of paper. We can talk him through the science and all the rest of it, and he doesn't actually know if that's the curve that's going to end up in reality. So is he going to get sacked for signing up to a level of false accept that's 0.5% or something similar? What's that? That's 1 in 200 attempts is fraudulent. That's kind of, if I've got 1 million calls a month, that's quite a significant kind of potential liability I'm signing up to. No one really equips them to make that kind of decision. So big issue at that kind of end of that delivery phase where we're kind of we've done all the hard work of integrating and plugging this stuff in, and then we suddenly get to press the button, and the people whose responsibility it is to press the button are not equipped to make the right decisions, and we can do something about that. I'm going to speed it up a little bit. So deployment then, this is I won't go my embarrassed. This is the start line marathon to Saab, 31st marathon finished, I think, 33rd, 31st last weekend. So it's a hard slog, yeah. A lot of technology solutions delivered in organizations, new mobile app, new online banking, customer migration, new product. You press the button and you see the results instantly. They're kind of, it's there, it's delivered. With these kind of solutions, voice biometrics, voice security, it's a long old slog to real value before you start seeing the payback of all of that investment and time. On day one, there will be no impact on your on any of your kind of top line metrics. On day two, in fact, at the end of month one, you'll be lucky if kind of seasonal variation and kind of the misplaced timing of an advert on Coronation Street haven't completely obscured any of your benefit case. So it's a long, hard slog, and there's a big onus, I think, on us as a community to make sure people focus on the right things through this slog. You also then, and I'll probably just get onto couldn't think of a better picture for this. So kind of when you get into the longer run kind of post-implementation, and we're really hoping to have, I think there's some really interesting stories coming out now. The longest running implementation in the UK is now 3 years old. They've been through a number of kind of tuning cycles through this period. They've kind of, similarly to my kind of wavy line graph at the start, they've really kind of oscillated around different levels of performance and are now kind of starting to settle on where they really want to be. But the one thing I can tell you that kind of doesn't portray too many competencies. The false accept rates, the false reject rates that we model in our great tools are nothing like what gets delivered in reality, because the vagaries of running these operations are such that invariably, and particularly at the moment with kind of fraudsters are pretty much they're easier targets than trying to impersonate somebody using a voice security solution. So fraudsters are staying away from these solutions. I don't think we know of an attributed breach yet in the UK. But on the flip side then, the operational environment is just so significantly more complicated, and the way in which customers actually interact with organisations is so significantly more varied than we can ever model, that we actually see false reject rates quite significantly higher than anything we model. And kind of managing those expectations in an organisation is quite hard. I then have a couple of real kind of quick lessons that I'll go to. So I think this is probably my kind of message to implementers and leaders and to the vendor community. So I think first off then is about ensuring understanding about how this stuff works. It's very easy to see a whizzy demo and a magic kind of tick go up on a screen or a green light, and you've got to remember, so some of the senior decision makers in organisations, that might be all they see of this kind of solution. So it went green when I ticked it. I've seen demos where live solutions about to go live have the very senior people have said, so what do you mean I have to claim an identity before it will test me against it? So I think people in this industry are very kind of we're very familiar with how this stuff works, but we often forget how kind of little understanding there is out there in the wider environment. If you don't really understand how it works, then you're not really equipped to make, not in the detail, but you're not really equipped to make decisions about kind of what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. So there's a big onus, I think, on vendors and kind of leaders of programs inside organisations to ensure a consistent level of understanding. And in fact, companies I'm talking to at the moment, we're really talking about almost kind of an induction program for people joining our programs. Like, you cannot be part of this program until you have been through this kind of basic thing, and that gives us the opportunity to kind of correct misunderstandings regardless of the level, and even doing that at kind of exec and steer code level. Second bit I see happen quite challenging is that you need to make sure the vision is really clear at the start. Now, you can optimise for convenience, which is what my butler's supposed to be here for, and the white glove service. There are other things you can optimise for, and in today's environment, some organisations are optimising for security, and that leads to some very different decisions. But if you've got one group of people optimising for security, and one group of people optimising for experience, and another wanting to see the cost benefits, then every single decision you make is going to be challenged, and it's going to be significantly harder to make than it might otherwise be. So you need to be really clear at the start and get everyone agreed about what that vision is, and keep coming back to it and stick to it. Finally, penultimately then, on this kind of picking up on the service design point, which I loved earlier, and that's certainly how we see a lot of these kind of decisions being. Do you know what? Some of the easiest ways to break some of these decisions is just to go to customers and test them, because you can sit in a room and hypothesize and draw stuff on a whiteboard and kind of get everyone's opinion, and then I think it's a hippo, so the highest paid person's opinion wins, and that's probably not what you want, particularly if you haven't necessarily been able to get that understanding opinion bit. So if you're escalating every decision, how many enrollment calls should you have? What's the right amount? How long should they be? What level of security does this actually achieve? If you're escalating all of those decisions up to the highest person in the organisation, you're unlikely to either do that quickly or to necessarily get the right answer. Whereas you can go to your customers, doesn't have to use technology, fake it, ask them, test what they're saying, test what it is they would want to do, and they will invariably help you through that thing. The same probably goes for colleagues as well. People sitting on the front line of these organisations deal with customers day in, day out. They know what will work, they know what won't work. And then finally, if you can't quite get the soft solutions to work, then you really need to go back to the value chain. And this is the final point I want to make. Kind of enterprises today are used to kind of dealing in this space down here. So someone calls in, I verify them, they either match the don't, and I do something. Yeah, they've never seen this stuff at the other end of They've never had to decide who should be eligible or not should be eligible. They've never had to really talk about consent for using some of this stuff. They haven't had to deal with the vagaries of numbers of enrolments and good qualities of enrolment. So people's mental model of this problem is is about these last 3 steps. So it's completely reasonable to expect me to get 100% of my customers verifying by voice at the end of a year if I only think about the world from this perspective. If I start thinking about it from the end-to-end value chain, then I can see that that's possibly a little unrealistic. So the earlier you can quantitatively model these outcomes and what's likely to happen at the end of the process, the easier it is to look, the better expectations you'll set, and the more likely it is that you won't have those kind of challenges later in the process. You also have the added convenience is that you can then model the different decisions you make, because a lot of them today, there isn't a lot of reference cases out there isn't a lot of public domain information. Vendors will have some information, but it's really up to you as an organisation to make both assumptions and decisions about how you wish to implement these sort of solutions. And there are ways in which you can kind of optimise this process. So modelling that value chain, trying to make decisions with A, the customer on one side, getting the emotional side, and B, quantitatively as you can on the value chain side is the way to kind of deadlock the solution, deadlock the problems. So I always finish with this slide. So I think kind of just the final points I want to make is like the technology, like you guys, friends, like the technology is awesome, but it has to integrate with an organisation, not just on the kind of the hard level, so interfaces and APIs and infrastructure, but on the soft level as well, so about culture and behaviour and decision making. And that's invariably, that's where the biggest challenges I think we'll find in this. There are ways, as I hope I've kind of been able to demonstrate, of kind of cutting through those. I'm kind of proof that you can solve those problems, but it needs kind of everyone to kind of buy into not just solving a technology problem, but a people and human problem as well. So that's all I have for you. A bit over.
Yeah, so we can consult our customers here. We could have question and answer or head out for drinks and snacks.
You put the drinks out.
No, are there any questions for Matt? Yes.
Given that these new technologies first and foremost present career risk to everybody in the organisation involved in choosing and implementing them, what are the real reasons why the executives within these organisations actually stick their necks out and end up deciding to go through this valley of tears?
So I think without attributing too much, I think you've got this kind of. I really like the adopter curve. So you've got an innovation value, yeah. So there's some organisations that will go for the innovation play, and it's about kind of reinforcing our brand values, and it's kind of you can contain the risk to a certain extent. If it doesn't work, then fair enough. You've then got the kind of really engages with it, understands the risk sufficiently, and willing to make a bet as part of a series of bets. So invariably, organisations are managing a portfolio of investments across this space and not just one. So it's kind of this is my 10 times bet, and this is my kind of 2 and 3 times bet. So in a portfolio, you typically see kind of maybe 10-15% allocated to somewhat more outlandish ideas. And then finally, I think what we will see if we don't see it, it's not being talked about publicly, is fear factor in the UK right now. So half of the UK banks are implementing voice biometrics. If you're the two that aren't, if you're the 2 major banks that aren't, then you really have to worry about you are really worrying about the fraud impact. And speaking as somebody who's been the domain expert in an organisation, when another organisation has announced something quite sexy in a Sunday paper, you really do not want to be that kind of domain expert on the end of the chief executive's email in his office at 6 a.m. on Monday morning, briefing him as to what we were doing in that area. So I think there's kind of, at the top level, there's kind of drive to do some of these things. In the middle, there's this kind of real kind of pragmatic portfolio management and kind of risk management, and at the bottom there are people trying to make their careers on it. It's done pretty well for me.
Get up early.
How long did it take the first one?
3 years to live.
3 years, and now when you go with that reference to the second one, it takes like what, a year?
It's difficult because some people aren't talking about what they've done. So I think we're seeing acceleration of that. We're definitely seeing acceleration, but we're also seeing kind of
expectation that acceleration is greater than it actually turns out to be, because some of these issues, some of the challenges are nothing to do with biometrics. They're about kind of organisations don't have a clear authentication strategy. You've still got people ticking boxes on the side of telephones. Like, how do you plug that into a multi-factor authentic? Just that there's a lot more legwork to be done, and then kind of just sheer state of infrastructure and other challenges going on. So, like in the UK, ring fencing, we have to make half our banks need to create new banks. That's not a small undertaking. That will definitely drive priorities and restrict availability of kind of assets that needed to make this stuff work.
Are you finding organizations leveraging this technology that we talk about business metrics a little bit differently? So, for example, many moons ago, I used to manage a contact center at a bank, and the KPIs I read up to my senior management were average talk time, average wait time, average abandonment rate.
Yeah.
And I could see using this as a metric to show how I'm reducing those would help the business case to help accelerate the implementations.
Yeah, I think so. Definitely making business cases on kind of service metrics, both NPS, although interestingly, the NPS kind of impact seems to be reasonably short-lived. So customers feel the difference and then they kind of forget that they felt a difference. And on handle time benefits. So real handle time benefits are being delivered. Certainly, the trouble with kind of some of these kind of approaches, certainly in passives, you kind of need to have a conversation, so you both get a handle time cost as well as the benefit. So for a while we were running at kind of zero kind of impact. So you definitely improve the experience. I think the other bit that we've kind of added into certain impetus is really starting to talk about the number of people failing our authentication methods, not as a kind of a good thing, but as a bad thing. So these are legitimate customers who called us, and 5% of people who called us today failed our authentication method. 5% of people who called us today were not fraudsters, that's for sure. A significant portion of those were legitimate customers that we failed to meet their needs, that probably drove interactions in our more expensive physical channels or even kind of attrition. So we've definitely seen kind of additional metrics be added in.
And on that cheery note, thank you, Matt, for those insights.